Hey everyone, Carmen here, digital editor at Ms. Back again from the National Sexual Assault Conference Exhibition Hall. I'm live at the Ms. booth with Lorenz Grant and Dr. Amy Tiemann, two of the women who helped make the film The Rape of Recy Taylor possible. So thank you both so much for being here with me today. And I guess just really quick, if you could expand a little bit on sort of what role you played in the making of the film. I know yesterday there was a screening and a discussion. There was a lot of clarification around who does what and what titles mean in making a film. I know you both were on the producing side. So if you could just expand a little bit on sort of what brought you to the film and what role you played in sort of making it into a thing.
Sure. Hello. My name is Lorenz Grant, and I'm technically and officially the consulting producer. Part of the team. It really does take a village to make documentaries, and the consulting producer is to direct vision in everything, just emotional support to any insights. I've worked on a lot of historical documentaries and providing any insights on where best to maybe find some historical nuggets, clues, sources, and also just to bounce off some creative ideas. So really the consulting, you just wear all the hats, but really it is to support the director, Nancy Bursky.
So an executive producer can do a number of different things. In the case of this documentary, The Rape of Recy Taylor, I, at the very beginning, helped director Nancy Bursky identify some source material that served as inspiration for the film. So the book At the Dark End of the Street by Danielle McGuire had a number of stories in it, and it just seemed like for untold stories of the civil rights movement, it was a great place to look. And then Nancy had the brilliance to focus in on the story of Recy Taylor and to take that story in a whole new direction, and realizing that if you tell one woman's story really, really well, it can actually tell the story of a whole movement by looking through that lens.
Awesome. Well, and I mean, there's so much to dig into that I don't even know where to start, but I think the power of media was a major part of the experience of seeing the film, especially for, me as someone who works in media, and, that it was actually part of the storyline of Recy's pursuit of justice was that, working with Rosa Parks and figuring out how to best utilize the Black press and the huge role that, media that was made by and for Black people in the time of Jim Crow was making such an impact in telling these stories that weren't being told, which is something that, we strive to do at Ms. is cover these feminist stories that other people aren't talking about. You're both very interested in telling those kinds of stories. That's where your background is. And so I'm just wondering what called you to sort of pursue this line of work, to pursue documentary and to pursue this specific film and sort of jump on board?
It's always a privilege to be able to continue these stories and add perhaps a new lens to what one may think is a familiar territory or a familiar story through an unknown hero or unknown heroine in this case. With the press, I'd just love to add that this is the era before all the hashtags, before social media, and in particular the Chicago Defender and a lot of the Black press, they were actually called as such, the Black press. They were speaking to their community from the pitfalls, the dangers, just, the celebrations, and also championing cases, because of course during this era, there was no justice system really. Justice denied was just par for the course. So the Black press was also very instrumental in championing cases, making people aware, hoping to get pressure to get governors or state officials or national officials to investigate cases, hopefully adjudicate the cases. So in the case of Recy Taylor, she never got justice, but she certainly got a lot of attention. And especially in that time in the 1940s, that was quite unusual. And vehicles and avenues like the Black press were just instrumental. We kind of forget and take advantage that it's so easy to let people know about things. And right now, which is great. It's how much has gone forward. But back then, that's what the Black press was for. That really is sort of the foundations of the First Amendment. You need the power of the press to tell these stories and be a champion. And for myself, getting involved in these documentaries, it's just so exciting to unearth this territory. And what I like to shine a light on the average hero. Everyone isn't born a hero. You become a hero, and you don't have to be famous to be a hero. I mean, literally, just speak out was such a heroic effort then. And Recy Taylor did talk about her rape, and she did go to the authorities, and she had her family to support her, but it was a very risky thing to do. And to have the Black press and Rosa Parks, that's how Rosa Parks was able to learn about the case as well, that those are all the ingredients that certainly were important for Recy's story, but also important for a documentary. And I love being able to unearth and uncover and find these stories and find these kernels, find the actual headlines, find the articles to actually include that. And since I worked on other films like the Black Panthers, the Freedom Riders, the Black Lives Matter movement, in some ways I'm just now realizing, all aspects of advocacy and media have been used, from the one phone line that the Freedom Riders had to put out a call to other Freedom Riders, to the press during the 40s for the Recy Taylor era, and Black Lives Matter. Now we're in social media and the hashtag. So I think the power of media is just so important and so crucial that it's exciting as a filmmaker to include those ingredients in documentaries.
And I love unearthing untold stories for their own right and their own value. And on top of that, I mean, the relevance of these stories to today is uncanny. I mean, the film premiered a year ago at the Venice Film Festival, and this is sort of before the Me Too movement was really bursting on the scene. So Nancy made this film. It comes out just as the floodgates open for all these stories to be told. And so everything we're learning from stories of Me Too, I mean, Recy speaking up in 1944, she was doing this over 70 years ago. And her story was actually also covered up in many ways, even historically. So the fact that some stories have been suppressed, we need even more to learn those lessons, because if we're being deprived of those stories and deprived of those lessons, missing in a lot of historical context that is extremely relevant today. And if I can just say one great thing for Ms. Magazine is, I hope you all think about how you've been around for an entire generation, because you did influence me. When my mom subscribed to Ms. from day one, so by the time I learned how to read when I was about 6 years old, there was a huge stack of back issues in the basement, and I read every single Stories for Free Children. Yay! And I read all the other articles that were, a lot of it was over my head, but some of it wasn't. So when I really think about shaping my worldview and what media has shaped me, it's literally been Ms. Magazine for my entire life. So thank you for that, and keep up the good work.
We will. That's a good education to have, I think. And I do think, that it is uncanny, and uncanny is one word for it. I think depressing, jarring, horrifying are other words for how relevant Recy's story is. To have watched that documentary yesterday in the middle of this conference where we're talking about all of these things, and in the middle of, this global and particularly this national moment of really examining rape culture was, a part of me was obviously so inspired, and then a part of me was really like, wow, that many years ago, and it's the same, so much of that storyline is the same. And I do want to circle back to that. I just have one more question about storytelling, which is that yesterday I thought it was really interesting that part of the film also focuses on the ways in which, Recy Taylor never found justice in a courtroom, but in some ways she was also maybe a little bit left behind, and some people were saying maybe she was a little bit used as this figurehead in a movement that then sort of moved on. They knew they weren't going to win, and they kind of just packed up and went their way. And, she went on to really continue to struggle, to not only continue to struggle because she was agitating and constantly, seeking that justice that she never found, but also just that her life was hard and no one really provided any support for her, was there for her. And that, struck me because I feel like as we are in this Me Too moment and everyone is being encouraged to speak up and tell their stories in so many ways, their stories are being leveraged for social good. This idea of look at all of these tweets, look at all of these, stories that are being shared. And we're actually running a storytelling project on Ms. right now about abortion access and abortion before Roe and stuff like that. And there's always this question of, if I'm going to use your story to advocate, how can I make sure I do it in a way that empowers you, that doesn't turn you into just, a tool in my toolbox that I'm using to achieve you're not just a means to an end. And so I'm curious as to how you all feel like you walk that line and, sort of practice that as storytellers. How do you tell a story and do someone justice and also, make sure that you're doing more than just telling their story in a way that engages other people. You're also telling their story in a way that empowers them and uplifts them and maybe even continues on the legacy of what they were fighting for.
Great questions, and I think we continue to grapple with it. It's almost like when you find the answer, let me know. But seriously, I do keep myself awake at night often thinking about that, because you are telling someone else's story, but it is unfortunately a familiar story. And I think the sort of idealist in me is it's an opportunity to shed light on the story that may not be known, but these circumstances were so familiar, and to share the actual risk. Like, really, it was life and death to speak out then, and her house was firebombed. So that was real. It was, we're now where it's, should I speak out because I may or may not lose the job or a position or a salary or something. But in that era, in the Jim Crow South in particular, I mean, just looking at, a black person looking at a white person askance could result in death or lynching, much less going to the authorities about being gang raped by your neighbors, basically. Yeah. So it was such stark extremes. And yet those extremes were part of the fabric of the culture that we experienced and lived as a country. And so I think as a filmmaker, I think it's important to spotlight that, certainly, but also as a reminder, like, this is, and it's not that long ago, just you get to see Recy, and she's in her 90s, but it's sort of to show this is living history. This isn't, some medieval tale. This literally is, one or two generations past. So I think that's what keeps me going, that, to show that this is what happened, what it was like, also to see how far we've come, and as well as how far we still have to go. I think today it is exciting that now one can be galvanized. Literally a hashtag can change the world almost. Then you needed the media, you needed some sort of attention, some sort of advocate, because your life was at risk, but also how do you penetrate the landscape nationwide if no one is advocating or helping you? And maybe that is the connection. Like, you still need neighbors, you still need advocates, we still need to work together to make change. Recy Taylor gained traction through this organization, these women working together, women and men, through the NAACP, through Rosa Parks advocacy. It's a window into the early Rosa Parks, who was she? We just know this simple sentence, and that needs to change, because she was so much more complex and so much more involved. So it's an opportunity to shed light on her story, and an opportunity to show that we can learn from the past, because if we don't know these stories, as hard as they are to hear, we need to hear them, because history repeats itself, as we see, and it just continues to repeat itself. The victim blaming, the shaming, the inventing excuses to make so the perpetrator can go to sleep at night, calling her name, saying that, oh, well, he was a prostitute, as if that means anything, but they needed some sort of justification. So I think that is some of the connections we can make to today, on how some of those, that hasn't really changed, but how we can use it to empower and rally around it. And because of social media, we can call things out much quicker. You don't have to wait days or months or years or decades or a generation. Now you can make things known quite rapidly. And I think that's the excitement of being in the documentary space, and some of the lessons and takeaways that we can we can learn and share.
It's a blessing and curse of social media is we can get the message out far and wide, but we can also lose control of it very quickly. So I think you're asking exactly the right questions about how to treat the people who you're interviewing. And it's a little scary. We're on the cutting edge where we can't predict what's going to happen when someone's story goes viral. But I think for Recy Taylor, it was very important that her family was very committed, very involved with the film, and her brother Robert Corbett, in his mid-80s, he's traveling the world with the story. He's made it his mission for a long time, for all these years, to get the story out there. So it's an incredibly important story, and I think that I really wonder, as Americans, how much we think we know history, but we don't. Do we really, really understand that you could not indict white teenage boys who had raped a black woman? They would not indict them. They had all the evidence. They had tons of confessions. They knew what happened, but the jury would not indict them. And even with the Emmett Till murder, which we think we know about, I mean, how many people, how many Americans, how many white Americans know that his killers were put on trial and they were acquitted? I think even fairly recently, I thought there was maybe like a mystery about who had done it, or had they caught them? And no, they knew who did it. They put them on trial and they were acquitted. And then in a magazine later on, they basically confessed. And now 70 years later, Carolyn Bryant, or decades later, Carolyn Bryant, the wife of one of the killers, the woman who supposedly had the incident that started this, recanted her story publicly. So again, living history. This is not the past. This is still in our fabric. But as we, I think right now as Americans, think about injustices that have been baked into our criminal justice system, I think we have not even come close to scratching the surface with how many racial injustices have been perpetrated up to this moment and what that history means for the present moment. So we're not done even beginning to learn our own history.
Well, that's a perfect lead into the next question, which was going to literally touch on all of that, which is, that Recy Taylor did make living history, because the justice system is still failing survivors in so many of the same ways, as well as, our culture at large is still failing survivors in so many of the same ways. And so in the course of being involved in making this film and seeing this film and having gone around and screened the film and heard from folks, one of the questions that was posed yesterday that I couldn't stop thinking about was Sandra's question of what will it take to end sexual violence? Because, that's the big call of this conference, and it feels like such a gargantuan undertaking, because it does, when you start really digging into this work, you start questioning whether, will it ever actually end? And so I'm curious, what did making this film and going through these histories show you about how we can make that kind of progress and how we do make that happen? And, like you said, how far we've come, but also how far we still have left to go. What did making this film show you about what we need to make sure we do in the path forward?
One of the many beauties of this is there's so many places and organizations that know how to navigate this space. Years ago, there were just no tools. You couldn't even talk aloud. You couldn't share your stories. You couldn't even share your stories maybe with family or friends or with intimate few. And now if you have if something has occurred or you're trying to work and advocate for people that love all this to stop, now there are places to go. And I feel buoyed and bolstered that I do feel like I'm a filmmaker. I don't have any special training, but I love the dialogue and the partnership, because you just never know where your film is going to land, the journey of it. Sometimes you're just so focused on, can I get it finished? And can I help Nancy finish this? And then it's finished. And now it has a life of its own. Now we're at a conference talking about this. So that is part of that progress and activism and agency in Now we can talk about it. Men are at the table. Everyone's at the table. Institutions are backing it and at the table and recognizing, this is in every sphere. This isn't just limited to color, creed, or class. It's literally affecting us all. And if we all as a nation, and I would of course dare say as a human nation, how will we really move forward if we can't address all of these things that they really do hold us back? A lot of people are slow to see that or accept that, but that's at the root. We're still talking about these issues because they're so prevalent, because they're so so many people did not get justice. So many people were killed. So many cases were unresolved. And now at least have much infrastructure to have a more curated conversation and live on. We don't necessarily have to be in the same physical space to have these conversations, because it's certainly expensive to travel all over the world, but you can now get online and hear stories in whatever language and whatever country. As sad as it is that it's still happening, then you can connect and have all these connections and hope to, change leaders, change legislation. Now I think we're finding what activists actually knew and believed, during the civil rights era, that there is this power of one, and the power of believing and being so focused and so committed that it can happen if you're committed and you're patient. I'm a very impatient person, but when you talk to activists who really lived it and, walk the walk and talk the talk, that's what happened. And now we have this collective power. We have so many more tools at our disposal today than they had 70 years ago. It's like, imagine what we can do with this. So that's the huge takeaway. Let's be really aware of how much we can change and affect change. And you don't need to be famous to do it. You just need to do something. And I think that is really extremely important, so people cannot feel so hopeless in this sea of all that's happening. You can really do some change. Now we can do this together and reach so many people more easily.
And I love the theme of ending sexual violence within the next generation. And I think this may have even been said yesterday, I think we need to work as though we're going to reach that goal in this generation, and realize that it may look more like progress generation after generation, but just keep going. And I think right now we're in a really interesting confluence of both awareness of the problem, but also the need to work on every single level. So do what you can in your friend circle, in your family, in your neighborhood. But then we get to the systemic level of schools and faith communities and laws. And I'm really interested in all of that. And I think just keeping an eye on the systemic level is really important. And so I'm also the new book, which is called Doing Right by Our Kids, Protecting Child Safety at All Levels. So that I'm just love seeing that we're looking at those levels, and news story after news story. Just when we think we can't be any more shocked by an abuse revelation from the Catholic Church, we get the grand jury report from Pennsylvania, which just lands like such a shock. Even after Spotlight and all the other things we've heard, it's still such a shock. And so it's like, what will it take for organizations? It's really rooting out corruption of the highest order. And so that can get very intimidating to think about, what could I possibly do to contribute to solving that problem? But we're not going to be effective in every single sphere, but we can be a lot more effective than we might give ourselves credit for. So wherever we are, we want to hold organizations to the highest standards, ask questions, demand answers. And as we've seen from Recy Taylor's case and so many other cases, it's really grassroots pressure from the bottom up is really the only force that has ever gotten these huge institutions to take the steps for change. I mean, the combination of that with some laws and things from the top, like Title IX, we've seen on college campuses. I'm not saying it's not important coming down from the top. It is. But student activists, church activists, grassroots activists, NAACP, Recy Taylor, it all kind of needs to come together at every level. But plug in where you can, do what you can, and if each of us does that, we're going to make a huge difference.
That's absolutely true. And you're sort of wondering, role can I play? And I'm curious, you talked about screening this film sort of as the Me Too explosion was just starting. And there were two very maybe conflicting takeaways that I had when I saw the film. And one was, oh my gosh, the immense power of every story and the urgency of telling our stories. And then the other takeaway was, oh, and if we tell our stories, our houses get firebombed and maybe it's all for naught. And there's one very optimistic takeaway and one very pessimistic takeaway that's possible from watching this film. And I'm curious, because Me Too is just this movement that is literally built on the idea that we need to break silence by telling our stories. And there's a lot of energy, and certainly some people have been held accountable, but we also see that Louis C.K. is coming back, and Harvey Weinstein's career is probably over, but many of the people who were accused or will be accused will probably still have their days in the sun. Woody Allen is still making films, so we know that even though there's so much energy, there's still so much there's still so much evidence that it might take even more stories. It might take even more energy. And in the midst of Me Too, what do you feel like the film's place has become in that discourse? You obviously weren't planning to release a film that touched so much on all those issues, but because the film did come out at that moment, sort of how did it evolve from there? And do you feel like it has sort of maybe pumped the gas on some of that stuff and accelerated that conversation in its own way?
Well, working on films, I always like to say sometimes it takes forever to land in the right perfect time. And I think what's really incredible now is it's important to just not forget the past. A lot of people, especially when you're trying to raise funds or raise awareness with particularly documentary films, there's always this slight pushback of, oh, again, we're still talking about that. Why don't you move on? Why don't you move forward? Well, we haven't moved on. We haven't moved forward. This hasn't even really been discussed. And so I think this film has landed sort of in this zeitgeist moment of certainly recognizing what's happening now, but also recognizing it's happened now because there's a past to this. So things don't happen out of nowhere. There's a culture in place. There's an infrastructure in place, an infrastructure of silence and power and connections. And Recy Taylor's story, I feel, is a great exemplar of, if you're in a small town, who's really in control of the small town? Who's really in control of not only the events, but the narrative, and how justice is, quote unquote, meted out or not. The sheriff himself was running around saying, keep your mouth shut, don't talk. So that is where this all comes from. And this is why we need to keep reminding ourselves, because it's staggering how history keeps repeating itself. So I think that said, now she can be included in this conversation. She also can be a hashtag, she too can be part of, Me Too. And I think it's, yes, it's sort of disappointing. It takes sometimes 70, 50, whatever years for people to see the light. But it's great to see that her brother, who literally, that has been his life's mission, to be premiered in Venice, for him to see people standing up and giving him an ovation, people that don't even know him, but now they know who he is and his story. And, part of that journey is it is nice. I think it is okay to salute some of those shock troops who've been in the movement forever and never did it for the popularity or the spotlight. And maybe that's also part of this Me Too. Maybe people get a little too excited to be in the media. But remind that a lot of people weren't doing it for the attention, and also to do the attention. And I think this is also less back then. They didn't know. There was no blueprint for the attention. Yeah. There was no way to navigate this when everything was at risk. When Rosa Parks came to just note take with her, she had to come in hiding. She had to come in secret. And when they found that she was there, they literally physically tore her out of the house and threw her down the stairs. So just even the simple, what we take for granted today, these steps of, hey, let's have a meeting, let's talk about it, let me share my story, just recognize that that was such a dangerous move back then, that now the film can hopefully land and be a part of that conversation where we can certainly talk about what's happening now. And also she had her family as a champion, her dad, her brother. Where are men in this space? Men still control everything basically. So, your responsibility is to be aware and to be involved. And we can all be aware and involved in a healthy space. I mean, just imagine if all of our energy in our offices, in our workspaces, in our family spaces were just spent on that. And not terror. How much more productive all of these spaces and healthier all these spaces could be. So I think, in our small journey, her story can resonate and land nicely in all of this activity.
And I think we need to take a moment and just realize and appreciate how revolutionary it is that we are believing sexual abuse survivors when they tell their stories. I mean, a generation ago, in many of these cases, it literally would have been incomprehensible. Like, someone's parents would not have had a framework to hear from a child, the priest abused me. It would have not been in their framework, in their mindset. It probably would have resulted in the child being slapped or punished, or like, don't you dare ever say that about a priest. Like, you can't say that. You can't. It's not on the table. And so much of abuse has been perpetuated by just utter denial. So just the amount of cracks in the facade that we've had. I mean, for people to believe that Harvey Weinstein or Woody Allen or Bill Cosby or these other powerful men, and in some cases women as perpetrators and men as victims, let's not forget that, to acknowledge that that's possible, to have it publicly aired and not covered up, even if there were many, many, many attempts to cover it up, the truth is coming out. So, the world will never be the same with those truths being acknowledged, and that is real progress.
Well, and that's a perfect lead into my last question, which is the question I've been asking everyone I talk to today. So the theme of the conference is bold moves. And we know it's going to take a lot of bold moves to end sexual violence in one generation, or even to keep fighting as if we can. And you all have done such incredible work. You've made many bold moves in your careers, and especially with this film. And so I'm just wondering, what's next? What's your next bold move? What are you going to do when you get home from Anaheim and sort of have to, keep fighting the fight?
Hopefully continue to make bold films. I'm now on I think it's a bold series. I would like to share that at some point in the future. I have a website, lorenzgrant.com. And to be in more bold spaces, and I've also sold one of my documentaries as a narrative series, Freedom Riders. And so I hope to boldly do that. There's storytelling can be bold in so many different formats. And I feel like with so many avenues and so many platforms, it's an exciting time to tell so many different types of stories and not forget those struggles, and even put them in a narrative lens and landscape for a different generation, different types of audiences, because there's so much that doesn't make, that is left on the cutting room floor. And a lot of these people's personal stories and struggles and drama around them and activism, to me, it's just so fascinating, because then again, it's like we think it's today, these multiracial groups coming together to make change. There were others before you. Some got attention and some just didn't, or it ended too soon. So I'd love to reclaim that and bring those back so it feels fresh, because I do think it feels fresh. To me, being bold is fresh. I'll just say that. And it just behooves us to keep trying to do that as best we can and empower others, and realize you have more power than you really think you do have.
Thank you. That's so inspiring.
So would like to continue to work to bring this documentary, The Rape of Recy Taylor, to more audiences. And I'm also working on more documentaries in the future, uncovering untold stories. But when I get home from the conference, it's literally the launch of the new book, Doing Right by Our Kids. And my goal for that is that this is kind of like the missing manual to parenthood. What I would love is for child abuse prevention, sexual abuse prevention, and sort of how to help empower your kid to explore the world with safety and confidence. I would like that to become part of parent education. right, this is not just something off to the side. This is like the missing chapter to the parent education book that everybody needs, because it's essential, and you can teach it in ways that aren't scary. You can teach it in a way that's very empowering, and parents, caregivers, and other adults in the community are an absolutely vital part of the equation. So I want to empower them to help do right by our kids.
Yay! And I'm going to put a link to that book and a link to your website in the comments on this video so that everyone can keep tabs. And thank you both so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for making the film and all of the other amazing things that you do, and for being here at this conference. So,
Our pleasure.
Thank you. Such a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Carmen.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. And